Welcome to the Forbes India cover story podcast series in association with theindigas.com. My name is Abhishek, and this issue's cover package is on how and if the new government will step on the gas on reforms and its impact on India Inc. This comes around the time that the new finance minister will present the union budget in July. It's an interesting time. Unemployment remains high. The GDP grew by just 5.8% in the previous quarter. Joining me on the call to talk about it all is Forbes India's editor, Brian Carvalho. Hi, Brian. It's always nice to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Abhishek, and hello, everybody.
We've had this government for the last 5 years. What are some of the priorities for Mr. Modi's second term?
Yeah, I guess with the fortnight to go for the union budget, the first one of the NDA government's second term, probably it's the right time to analyze and report on what the expectations from it are. So the expectations broadly are around the areas in which some work has been done in the first term. I mean, industry has a lot of expectations, big industry as well as small industry. The farm sector has aspirations. Startups have their own set of aspirations. Investors, of course, are always never satisfied, so they have their own set of expectations. And it's citizens like you and me also who look forward to the budget for something or the other. I'll start with the expectations of the industry. So basically, they want the government to revive the consumer sentiment, which is pretty muted now, as we all know, and that's probably reflected in the slowing GDP growth. And so one way to revive that consumer sentiment may be by cutting taxes. We don't know whether that's going to happen, but that's clearly one expectation. From the private sector's point of view, they basically want incentives to invest. There's very little happening in the private sector. Nobody is expanding. Nobody is willing to commit investments. So what can the government do to kind of actually stimulate growth in industry? Third challenge for the government here is to allocate funds for public expenditure, right? So it's kind of a tightrope walk, right? Especially at a time when you have to keep an eye on the fiscal deficit, which is at 3.4%. But at the same time, the finance minister will have to bite the bullet and, industry wants government to reduce corporate tax, rationalize the minimum alternate tax, right? So those are clearly expectations that could boost sentiment.
The sentiment, the consumer demand as such has gone down. Just a couple of months ago, the two-wheeler and four-wheeler sales, which are a proxy for consumer demand in India, they were almost at an all-time low. What explains that?
Yeah. So one explanation for the slowing demand, and this is only one part of it, is the NBFC crisis, right? Because a lot of NBFCs are facing liquidity issues, and they are the biggest. I think 75% of all consumer loans come from the NBFC sector. The lending from NBFCs for two-wheelers and four-wheelers has slowed down dramatically, and that is probably just one explanation for the slowdown. But we've also seen the slowdown kind of permeate into the FMCG sector, where CEOs are saying that there's just not enough demand. So clearly there's a bigger problem somewhere. Okay, people said that, okay, we're waiting for the election results. Okay, now we have the election results. We have a resounding victory. One would expect demand to pick up. Will it pick up with a lag? Will this festive season be a great one? We don't know. There are no signs that it will be a great season or there will be a turnaround of sorts. The budget against that backdrop is probably a perfect canvas for the government to unleash. I won't use that cliche big bang reforms, but I would say some effective reform.
And what would that constitute, Brian, in that we play this tape recorder once in 5 years talking about land reforms, labor reforms, we meaning all, whether it's journalists or economists or even on podcasts. Now, with a majority the BJP enjoys, they can definitely move in that direction. But do you see that happening? For example, labor laws, these were largely written back during the British era. To give you an example, if there is a factory which hires more than 50 employees, it cannot sack an employee unless there is an explicit permission from the government because of the laws as they state. And hence, these companies keep their strength to a minimum amount so that they hire contract laborers rather than full-time, which doesn't really help anybody.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I've been reading about an exit policy. That's been an expectation from industry for the last 2.5 decades I've been in this profession. And I think no government has had the courage to actually pull it off because it's extremely unpopular. It's not going to win you votes. And you have Swadeshi elements on the fringes of this government too, which will not be too happy with such a development. Having said that, I think the most predictable thing about this government is its unpredictability. Will they have the courage to actually come out with an exit policy? I have absolutely no clue about that. Right, because this is also a time when anyway private sector employment is not looking too good, right? There are layoffs happening anyways. And the job market is pretty depressed. We all know how huge the crisis of employment, unemployment, and underemployment is at the moment, right? So I think from the employment point of view, Niti Aayog, the government's think tank, has actually come up with a good idea. It's a pretty novel idea, and it's a fresh solution that we require. I mean, we can always kind of, as you said, every 5 years talk about the same things about exit policies and reviving consumer demand, bringing down corporate tax and all that. But this suggestion of Niti Aayog of creating a national employment policy, it's a long-term kind of solution, possible solution to tackle the crisis of unemployment. And let's get one thing right. Unemployment is not a problem that can be solved overnight by one government or by one budget. So you need some long-term structural solution, right? Because we know what the latest data from the National Sample Survey Office shows, that unemployment is at a 45-year high of 6.1%. That's one of the stories we had in the magazine. Nandika Tripathi, one of our writers, traveled to Kerala, the state with the highest unemployment rate. And that's interesting because Kerala is also considered is India's most literate state. Right. So Nandika traveled to Thiruvananthapuram to see how the state is coping there. And what she found is that there are youth who still prefer a government job than one with the private sector. Even a TCS, even to a TCS, people are preferring a government job. The reason for it is job security. So that, in a way, highlights the fear of being laid off, which is not uncommon in many industrial sectors these days. And Nandika also found out that many of these youth have qualifications that are in no way connected with the professions they seek to pursue. And that's what results in the scourge of underemployment, or people in jobs that have little to do with their qualifications. That's why a national employment policy is imperative. I think an integrated solution is what is required, and probably we could see something like that being announced in the budget.
Right. And moving on, package also talks about manufacturing. The phrase Make in India is something that we were badgered with back in the first term of this government.
Right.
How does that look in the context of what was promised and campaigned for, and what has led to fruition?
I think I remember in September of 2014 that the newly minted Modi government launched Make in India with much fanfare. And this was done to encourage domestic manufacturing. The origins of Make in India lie sometime in 2003 during the NDA government of that time with Vajpayee as its prime minister. It was in that year that the hill states of Uttarakhand, Himachal, J&K and the northeastern states were granted SOPs to encourage investments. And one such hub that emerged in Himachal at that time is the Baddi Barotiwala Nalagarh corridor. So, and you had FMC giants like Dabur and Colgate, pharma companies like Cipla, Dr. Reddy's putting up factories there. But unfortunately, the problem now is that the tax holidays in Uttarakhand and Himachal have lapsed. And this corridor that generates over 30,000 crore in turnover is probably not as much of a favorite of industry as it once was. Some 118 units have shut down there, and over 9 lakh people are facing unemployment. That's what Divya Shekhar, who traveled to Baddi, found out when she went there. She also tried to find out from industrialists what they want from this budget to make this hub of activity buzzing again. Pretty clear they want better infrastructure and planned rather than haphazard development. What is needed is probably a holistic view of Make in India, which means give people better infrastructure. Tax ops are always welcome, but I think there needs to be coordination between various ministries. I mean, the infrastructure ministry, the guys who are creating the roads need to be in tandem with the state governments in there. Probably in states where you have both BJP governments at the state and at the center, it becomes easier to coordinate expectations.
There were many promises from multinational organizations. Foxconn comes to mind, where they
Hmm.
spoke of investing more than $5 billion in Maharashtra alone in the next few years. So the promises were made, but I think the implementation is still either ongoing, delayed, or shelved altogether, given the time that it takes. And the article that I read in the package talks about how tedious it can be to fill up the paperwork to get various permissions. Land
Yeah.
acquisition laws still are archaic.
True, true, true. Yeah, and ease of business along with Make in India, I think there's much more that needs to be done there. The ease of starting a business is not exactly great in India. So there's room for improvement. I mean, the good news is that in the first term, the government, they laid down the agenda, right? But now there needs to be some thorough follow up on how do you actually deliver on many of these promises.
Usually the budget sets the tone for the year in terms of what to expect. What do you expect on the day when the finance minister steps up?
See, I think one area where they seem to have done well, and this is probably reflected in the election results, right? I mean, one school of thought is that the social sector schemes have touched millions of lives in states like Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, and that probably had a big role to play in Modi government's resounding win. Right. So what we did is one of the Forbes India team members, Naini Thakkar, traveled to this village in Rajasthan. It's called Mundia Kalan. It's about 80 kilometers off Jaipur. So she saw firsthand how, the various schemes like the Swachh Bharat mission, which involves having toilets in homes, the Ujjwala Yojana, supplying cooking gas, and the Jan Dhan Yojana of opening bank accounts, how they've actually made life easier for rural India, and that, as I said, may explain the kind of thumping victory we saw in states like Rajasthan. Yeah, these many of these schemes are still work in progress, and Naini actually analyzes in a story how NDA 2.0 can improve on them. I won't give away too much from that story, but one expectation clearly is that, for example, is that you've given us LPG connections now. I mean, you've increased the number of LPG connections drastically. Now, how about making the process of getting refills simpler? It's not very cheap also. So probably coupled with your light bill and your LPG bill, you end up paying quite a lot at the end of the month, right? So if that can be made less expensive, I think that's clearly an expectation in some parts of rural India.
Right. You spoke about the social side, although it's not entirely related, but
Absolutely.
agriculture is some because there's such an urgent need to do something about it. June to September, for example, brings 3/4 of all rainfall, and it's erratic most of the time. 2/3 of land under cultivation depends entirely on rainfall, no irrigation. So the package also touches upon the need for doing something about that bit which has been plaguing India and for such a long time. More than 500 million, isn't that right? Are depend on agriculture.
That's true. But unfortunately, agriculture still its contribution to GDP is declining, right? So I think we'll have to minimize our agricultural activities, but make it more productive. So that would mean moving a lot of people out of agriculture also, right? And I think that process is on, and that's why I think industry is important. The startup wave is important. So as more people get employed, as more people get self-employed, and we are seeing that slowly people are moving away from agriculture. But at the same time, I think we need to figure out how do we make it more productive, right? How do we probably build a bridge between, and that's where technology can come into play. How do you build a bridge between consumer and farmer without the middleman taking away the spoils? I think that is essentially the problem. The other problem is that if I, as a consumer, benefit, it doesn't necessarily mean that the farmer is benefiting, right? Because I'm benefiting at his cost. So a win-win situation is if both farmer and consumer are happy, and that's where agri-tech can play a big role. That's where we come back to the startup phenomenon, because we have a lot of agri-tech startups, right, who are trying to make a difference to Indian agriculture. So more power to them, and that's where I think what the government can do for startups via Startup India or otherwise is important.
Right. Well, I think on that note, in the interest of time, Brian, although we can go on for a while,
Yeah.
it's time to wrap up. Thank you very, very much for your time on this one.
Thanks, Abhishek.
Thanks. And all you listeners, you know the drill. You can get this podcast on ForbesIndia.com as well as on iTunes. And to have someone call you for a Forbes India subscription, just message Forbes to 51818.